Okay, this is our last video lecture for the semester. I'm glad we've all made it this far. I hope everybody's doing well. I see most folks are working on the last test as we speak. It's all over on the 18th, right? That's the last day of the semester. I will be on campus on that day, Wednesday, in the morning. So starting at about 9 o'clock, I'll be there for a little while. If you need to talk to me in person or want to ask any questions in person or anything like that, feel free to find me there. I'm blanking on my room number, but if you're coming, just text me, and I'll find a way to get you to where I'm at. Um, these questions for this section of the book are pretty involved, and it's a big, it's a huge chunk of pretty complex history, and there's a lot of misrepresentation of this history and a lot of misunderstanding about it. And so I want to focus on a couple of things here. The first is the Reformation. There were lots of questions about that, and the questions kind of led me to believe that just the general shape and outline of this event in history is something you guys, for the most part, haven't grasped the shape that this thing actually took. I got a lot of questions about Catholicism and Christianity and what the Reformation was and what the Counter-Reformation was, and so the book kind of deals with this stuff. But I want to go over it a little bit in this lecture and see if I can pull some of these threads together for you guys. Now, the first thing to know about Christianity in this context of the Reformation is that Christianity was one unified religious expression for a very long time. So from the time that the church kind of came out from underground and became officially recognized in the Roman Empire and basically took over the Roman Empire, Christianized that whole part of the world. From then until the Reformation in the 1500s, the church was one thing. If you were a Christian, you were a Catholic Christian. The word Catholic means universal in Latin. That's what the word means. And so when people say Catholic, they mean universal. And at that time, it was true that this was the Christian church, the expression of Christianity. And there were some divisions and some disputes about theology, some fights over who was the real pope. There were rough times, but by and large, Christianity had a unified front. It was a unified thing. It always came back together again. The disputes were resolved. The differences were reconciled, and the church, as a single institution, kind of marched on. And during the early conflicts with the Muslim folks and Islam as a religion, and you have this whole situation with um, the Crusades and that whole war between uh, European Christianity and Middle Eastern Islamic culture. But one of the reasons that the European nations, the European peoples, were able to basically not win that war, but they kept Islam from stomping all over Europe, which it looked like it was going to do. When the early parts of this kind of Islamic invasion happened, the Islamic people had the best weapons, the best tactics, the best military, the best everything. They were far superior in many ways to the Europeans they were trying to conquer. And uh, one of the only reasons that Europe was able to survive this was that they presented a united front. And when the Pope was said, the Pope is the head of the Roman Catholic Church, right? He would call up people, say, "Listen, we not call on the phone, but he would call up forces, right? He would unify the rulers in Europe against this invasion." And the Crusades to go and take Jerusalem were not they were an attack. They were also a counterattack. Islam invaded first, and the thinking behind gaining Jerusalem back was that it would give Western Christianity a foothold in the Middle East, where they could fight these wars a little further away from home. But that's all involved. Like, that's a lot of history. I could spend a year talking about that stuff. But what I want you to get from that is that Christianity was one thing. There were no denominations. There were no different churches. Every church you went to would be a Catholic church for a very long time, for 1,500 years or so. And then what happened was the church became enmeshed in the world in ways that were problematic. What began as a religion of the poor and of the underclass folks in society. Most of the early Christians were poor people in the beginning. I mean, the apostles, many of them were fishermen. They worked with their hands. They were not educated, influential, powerful people. This religion began and grew and spread amongst ordinary folks. But as the church got stronger and as it became an official institution, it began to take on the trappings of wealth and power, and in many ways became indistinguishable from the secular kings and princes and rulers of that age of the world. The Pope had his own army at this time. The Vatican was immensely wealthy. There were lots and lots and lots of things about Christianity that did not look like what is depicted in the Bible. And there were all kinds of abusive things happening in terms of a way for the Pope to raise money. One of the things the church did was it sold indulgences. And indulgences were basically a get-out-of-hell-free card for people who could pay for it. The idea was that if you had committed some kind of horrible sin, you could, with money, buy an indulgence from the Pope. You could have your sins forgiven in return for cash on the barrelhead. And that's not okay. And many, many people who were Christians at that time saw that this was not okay and said so loudly. But what Martin Luther did, the beginning of the Reformation, was he did something unique. Whereas everyone else who was protesting the kinds of worldliness and the greed and the abuses of Catholicism at that time, they were trying to reform the church from within. The idea was, let's get back to what we were. Let's stop doing this. Let's return to the earlier expression of Christianity, and let's get rid of this corruption. But what Luther did was he said, let's just blow the whole thing up. Let's make a new church. Not let's reform Catholicism, but let's make a new church that is opposed to Catholicism. He saw Catholicism as completely unredeemable. And he believed that he had read the Bible and understood it better than anyone else, and that he could form a new church based on his understanding of the Bible. Now, the problem here is that he never imagined what would come after that. When Martin Luther made his break with the Catholic Church and began to teach his theology, he thought that he had done the job. He believed he knew what the authentic Christian church should look like, and all he had to do was preach it and teach it to people, and everything would be fine. He never dreamed that other people would read the same Bible for themselves and come up with different interpretations from his, and then begin breaking away from him. And that happened almost immediately. Within Martin Luther's lifetime, new reformers appeared on the scene with all kinds of weird and crazy ideas. And there were wars, and there were uprisings, and there was mass chaos in the social order as a result of this. One city in Germany, I'm forgetting the name, but this is probably the ugliest episode in the whole Reformation, and it kind of points out all that was wrong with it. Germany was solidly Protestant. Martin Luther was a German, and they broke away kind of as a group from the Catholic faith. But this one city, a couple of people showed up calling themselves prophets, and they had a word from God, and that was that God wanted them to establish their own theocracy, their own kingdom, their own church within this city. And as a result of this, the people in the city who believed this stuff rose up, and the bishop was living there of that area, and he had to flee for his life. They took over the whole city. One of the first things they instituted was polygamy, right? Um, if you read the Bible for yourself, if you just read it and don't have any context whatsoever, there is literally nothing that says a person should only have one wife. It's not there. And in fact, there's a whole lot of stuff, especially in the Old Testament, about people having multiple wives. Abraham, Solomon, all these Old Testament patriarchs had lots of wives. And so these folks, once again, just throwing away all tradition, throwing away everything the church had taught before, and understanding the Bible for themselves, started instituting polygamy in that city. One of the leaders actually had a woman executed in the public square for not agreeing to marry him. And like I said, this is ugly history, guys. So the bishop who had to flee for his life, he ponies up an army of forces, gets some people behind him, goes and takes the city back. The people who were the leaders of the group that had taken the city first, he had them tortured to death and then hung in cages from the steeple of the cathedral there in the city. And those cages are still there to this very day. You can see them if you go on a tourist trip to that city. And I'm blanking on the city. I'll try to remember. I mean throw it down in your supplementary stuff after this. But that was typical of this time, of people. When Martin Luther blew up the whole social order of religion that had unified Europe forever, he did not think it was going to result in this incredible upheaval and this fracturing of Christianity. He thought he was just going to restart the authentic church, and that after that there wouldn't need to be any more. And you can see this going on even to this very day, right? Anybody that reads the Bible for themselves and thinks they have a different idea about it can rent a little storefront and make their own church. And if they get enough people to follow them, they become a large, important denomination. This happens all the time. Christianity fractures and fractures and fractures and fractures as a result of differences in the way that people interpret the Bible. And there's some very important differences there. Very different ways of understanding the nature of God, the nature of salvation, who Jesus was, all these things. That if you go back and you actually look at the founding documents of many of the denominations that we know today in our own city, like the Baptist or the Nazarenes or the Presbyterians or the Lutherans or whoever, you'll find that there's some serious doctrinal differences in the beginning of those ideas. Now, of course, in practice, there's more unity than there is in just the official documents, right? Most people who are Christians kind of agree on some very major parts of their belief. But I know a lot of Baptists would be pretty shocked if they went back and read what Baptists are supposed to believe, because there's some pretty radical stuff there. And it's a particular understanding of the way that God works in the world that is one of the fruits of the Reformation. The Baptists are direct inheritors of John Calvin's ideas, his theology. And he was an early breakaway from Martin Luther. His own ideas about what God was like. And what Calvin taught was the doctrine of the absolute omnipotence of God. God is so powerful that human beings really don't have any choice. His theology says that every person from the day they are born is either destined to go to hell or destined to go to heaven, and there's nothing that they can do about it. If you're destined to go to heaven, then you'll become a Christian, and if you're destined to go to hell, you won't. But this is not your choice. You are simply a kind of a piece of a machine that God has running, and some of those pieces are destined for one place, and some of those pieces are destined for another place. And there is nothing that a human being can do. It's the denial of free will. That God is so powerful that if we think appropriately about God, we would say that human beings don't have any choice. And that's a foundational thing in a lot of Protestant denominations, that idea. And so there are all these differences. And Martin Luther is the beginning of this, the beginning of the breakaway and the fracturing of a unified Christianity into a whole lot of different belief systems and different denominations based on those belief systems. And like I said, we can still see we see this every day. If you drive through the city, right? Every church you go by, right? You don't know what it's going to say. Um, the Baptist church that's just outside of our campus at Redlands, if you drive by, you'll see a little on the sign there. There's a little thing that says KJV. And what that means is that particular church believes that the King James Version of the Bible is an inspired translation, that any other translation of the Bible is um, suspect or even evil. They'll say that one of the sayings of the KJV only people is the King James Version is the only version and all else is perversion, right? Um, and that's an extreme belief, but people hold it, and they will divide churches up based on this. Um, this is one of the newer things that has divided Christianity between churches who believe that there's only one legitimate English translation of the Bible, and people who believe that all of our Bibles are translations of one kind or another. And so this is just this landscape that we live in today. But it was not the world that people were living in prior to Martin Luther. Prior to that, there was one unified idea of what Christianity was. And now there is no longer. And so the Catholic Church, which still exists, right? I am a Roman Catholic. That's my um, place where I go to church. It's still there, right? It didn't just disappear. All these other things broke away from it, and it kind of stayed where it was. And then the Counter Reformation then is the Catholic Church's reaction to the Reformation, and much of that was horrible. There was a lot of cruelty, a lot of war, a lot of violence. Human beings are human beings, and bad things were done on all sides. That's the thing, that there's a lot of distortion in Oklahoma history books, or the things we hear in Oklahoma, because this is largely a Protestant place. Um, and so, if you just hear one side of this story of the Reformation, you'll hear that these brave and courageous, freedom-loving Protestants broke away from the tyranny of the church, and the church persecuted them. And it's that which is true. But what's not said is that the Protestants themselves did their own fair share of persecuting. Um, each denomination generally believed that it was the only one that should be listened to or believed in, and would begin, when they got power over an area, murdering anyone who disagreed with them. Um, uh, John Calvin himself, the guy that founded Calvinism, which is the root of a whole lot of different denominations that are still with us, he had an adversary of his burned alive over a slow fire. Um, we were not going to burn him too quick; it'll be over too fast. That's not the action of someone who just thinks, well, let's all believe what we want to believe and be free from tyranny. That's not the way that worked. Um, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, that we read about in our American history classrooms, and we have this tradition of the Pilgrims coming to America for religious freedom. That's not what the Pilgrims were doing. The Pilgrims, the Puritans, had been a very powerful sect in England for a while. They came to power and they started doing some pretty horrible things. They had a king beheaded, um, and they had basically made themselves unwelcome in England. And as they kind of fell out of favor, they fled to America to establish their own theocracy here. The idea was not that the Puritans were wanting religious freedom. They wanted a place where they could force everyone to believe what they believed, and a new colony in the New World would be a great place to do that. Nobody's going to bother you there. And so there's just, one of the things you get from reading a book like this and taking a class like this is an overview of how horribly people behave to one another a lot. And the history of the Reformation is full of horrible things like that. But that's the general shape of it. Now, there's another aspect of the Reformation I want to point out. It's this. The church was incredibly wealthy. And the church was established in pretty much every city, every nation in Europe. The church was a huge factor in that culture. And because of this, the church owned a great deal of land and property and buildings. Um, were literally the equivalent of billions of dollars in church property on any king's territory. And the property of the church and the places the church owned were answerable to the church, to the Vatican, and not to the king of that area. And so the king or whoever ruled that place couldn't get their hands on that wealth or that property. But when the Reformation started and Martin Luther began to spread his ideas and people began to see that this break from the Catholic Church might actually work, that large groups of people were going to go along with this, rulers in various areas in Europe saw an enormous opportunity to enrich themselves and all their friends. And a great deal of the secular backing of the Reformation was motivated by this factor. So Henry VIII, for instance, in England, when he had his break with the Catholic Church, he was able to put his hands on literally billions of dollars of money just sitting there. You kick all the Catholics out of your country, suppress the religion, and take their stuff. And that's what they did. And a great deal of English nobility to this very day comes from that particular theft, if you will. If you ever watch, there's a very popular historical soap opera on Channel 13. You may have seen it or heard of it. It's called Downton Abbey, and it's all about these aristocrats in England at the turn of the century, this last century, 1900s. And they're in this house, this grand estate called Downton Abbey, and Lord Grantham is he's the patriarch of that particular house and property. But an abbey is a place where monks live. Downton Abbey was at one time an abbey. And the reason a British aristocrat is living in it now is because his grandfather's grandfather's grandfather, right, got it given to him by Henry VIII in the breakup of the Catholic property in England after Henry broke from the Catholic Church. And so lots of people in power in Europe made some very shrewd calculations and decided whether they wanted to remain on the side of the church or to go with the Protestants and get the stuff that they could get their hands on as a result of that. And Europe was torn apart as a result of this particular set of circumstances. Another thing that Martin Luther never really intended himself. He did not think that this would end in wars and violence and bloodshed and conflict and theft and all the stuff that happened. It just I don't know what he must have thought about this as he watched the world crumble around him as a result of his ideas. Hard to say, but that's what happened, and we still live with the ramifications of that even now. The next thing I want to deal with, and then I'll be done here. I will say it kind of hurt my heart a little bit when I saw that some of my lectures that I put up have fewer than 10 views, right? Which means that you guys aren't watching these, and I'm working very hard to do them. So if you have watched them, if you are watching them, thank you. You're giving me a reason to exist. But the next thing I want to deal with is the Spanish conquest of the New World, because that also is a situation where there's some misunderstanding and even deliberate falsehood. Your book, this is the only time this has happened to me, honestly, your book has a flat-out lie in it. It's not true what your book says at the very end of the section on the conquest of the New World. One of the ways to frame this thing, the Spanish take in, look, it was awful. They absolutely devastated and destroyed the native populations in South America, and did it primarily for money, for the gold that could be had as a result. These cultures had lots and lots and lots of gold, and the Spanish conquistadors wanted it, and Spain, the government of Spain, wanted it. And the government of Spain was Catholic. That one of their calculation in the breakup of Christianity was, we're going to remain Catholic. And so they felt that they could do whatever they wanted in the New World, with the backing of the church. And your textbook says as much. It says the Catholic Church basically gave its blessing to these atrocities. And your church, the book mentions a particular monk, De La Cruz. What's his name? Hold on, I know if I'm Francisco de la Cruz. And it says that he wanted to treat the natives kindly, and that he said that they should we shouldn't be doing this to them, and that the church burned him alive for these progressive views. That is literally not at all what happened. And I'm not saying anyone should ever be burned alive for what they believe, but what De La Cruz was doing was not trying to emancipate the Indians and make the Spanish conquistadors treat them better. He was kind of wanting to set himself up as the Martin Luther of the Americas. He wanted to break away from the church completely, and he had this idea that the church, the center of Christianity, would move to the New World with himself established as the Pope. And one of the things that he was telling people was that God had given these indigenous people into the hands of the Spanish so they could be their slaves forever. That was what he was professing, and what he was trying to teach. And people started to go along with this, because remember, there's lots of gold, there's stuff to be had. And you can see how someone, a shrewd person with a military background and enough troops behind them, would say, yeah, let's go along with this guy. He's going to endorse what we say and what we want to do. The Pope himself wrote an encyclical, which is one of the things popes do. What the Pope is supposed to do is he's supposed to decide in matters of faith and morals for all of Christianity, for all of Catholic Christianity, and which was, as I said, at this time in the world breaking apart. But the Spanish were Catholic. And the encyclicals are letters the Pope writes to clarify things, to say, okay, there's a question about this, and I'm going to need to clarify this. This will happen in our very near future. It is happening now. But for instance, the issues behind the internet and what is done with the internet and the way people deal with the internet, the Pope's going to have to say something. He's going to have to say, this is okay, this is not okay, right? In the very near future, we're going to be able to live entire virtual lives online. And I'm pretty sure the Pope's going to say, nah, I don't think that's a good idea. We shouldn't be doing that. I don't know, right? But that's going to happen in the near future. Well, this was a situation where the Pope took a look at what was going on in the name of the church in Spain and wrote an encyclical. I will put a link to it below this video. And he basically says in no uncertain terms that native peoples are human beings with souls. They are rational beings, and that no one can deprive them of their property, their lives, or their liberty. That is a grave sin against God and the plan of the devil. And so your book leads you to believe that what happened with the Spanish in Mexico was at the request of the church, or at least at the church was kind of cheering this on. The opposite is true. According to what the Pope himself said, everything that the conquistadors did in the Americas was a grave and mortal sin. But the Spanish rulers and the Spanish crown were much more interested in keeping that money coming in. And so the Pope's encyclical was ignored. But that's what happened. And so it kind of astonishes me, because it took me a while, guys, to run down Francisco de la Cruz. I'd never heard of the guy until I read this in your book, and I went, I know something. I've done a lot of studying of Catholic theology. That does not sound like something that would be okay. And sure enough, when I did the scholarship and actually looked the guy's life up, what your book says is the exact opposite of what is historically true. And any author who knows the name of Francisco de la Cruz should know that, right? They can find the same resources I found, and yet there it is. And I don't know quite what to say about that. But it is what it is. And so I'm hopefully some of you guys will view this video and know that, that your book has not told you the truth about something. Otherwise, it's an awesome textbook, by the way. I like this book, but not that part of it. And the last thing I want to talk about is Cortez. Cortez's story would make an awesome movie. I'm sure there are movies, but I'm surprised there's not a contemporary movie about his life. It's the stuff of, I don't know, fiction. It's hard to believe this really happened. The story of Cortez is that he's stationed in Cuba, and he wants to take an expedition into the New World, into Mexico, find out what's there. They think that there's wealth there. They think there's people there. They've got some, the Spanish were kind of exploring that area a little bit, but Cortez was going to go just march right into the heart of what is now Mexico and find out what's there. They didn't know. He took about 600 men or so, 50 horses, 4 or 5 boats, ships, and sailed from Cuba to the coast of Mexico. And the governor of Cuba, he wanted to do that expedition himself. He could see that there was a possibility of winning a lot of fame, a lot of money, and a lot of glory by doing this. He wanted to do it. He did not want Cortez to. So Cortez left without this guy's permission. The governor of Cuba, and I'm blanking on his name, but you can look it up. The governor sent a messenger to Cortez before he set sail saying, don't do it. I'm not going to let you. And Cortez's brother had that guy intercepted and killed, murdered him. So Cortez got news of this, that the governor was going to stop his mission, so he just took off, pretending that he didn't know that he had been recalled. And so he arrives on the shore of Mexico. People with him are terrified, right? Can you imagine? They're looking around saying, we got a few hundred people and some horses, and we're going to march into the middle of a place. We have no idea what's there. We don't know what's going on. And there, a rumor, there were people who were like, I don't know if this was right. And so Cortez burned his ships where they sat, at the shore, burned them behind him, so that now everyone's committed. We either get this done or we die. And so he marches into the heart of Mexico, and he encounters people there. He encounters the Aztec civilization. And first he encounters the cities that surrounded Tenochtitlan, which is what the main city in Mexico was called then. What is now Mexico City sits now where that place was. And these little satellite cities surrounding the main capital had their own populations, own people, and they were the victims of the people in the Aztec capital in a particular kind of way. The Aztecs in Tenochtitlan had absolute superiority militarily over that whole region. And their whole religious system was based on human sacrifice and cannibalism. And every textbook I've ever read about this incident, about this moment in history, downplays that fact, that human sacrifice and cannibalism was a daily occurrence in the Aztec capital. And even in some of the surrounding cities around there. This is just what people did. And so basically what the Aztecs were doing was they were allowing these other cities around them to exist solely for the purpose of reconquering them and getting human sacrifices as a result of that. And so there was this kind of ritual warfare that happened all the time around that area, where the Aztec army would just show up on the outskirts of one of the cities, and they would have a ritual battle, and they would haul off people to be sacrificed. And so when Cortez shows up, he starts figuring out what's going on here. And the people in these surrounding cities are like, wait a minute, this is something new. This guy might be able to be the head guy in charge here. And so they kind of threw in their lot with him. And so while Cortez only had a few hundred men and a few horses, really, He had about 20 to 30,000 native peoples from these other cities around Mexico City, around Tenochtitlan, who sided with him in this thing. And the rest of the story is um, in your textbook, in a kind of a brief outline form. But the night of the big battle was just it's just this is what happens. I can't believe this has truly happened. So Cortez, he marches into Mexico City with all these native warriors and all of his horses, all this stuff. And there really was a legend. There was a prophecy in the Aztec religion about this white god showing up with this shining skin, right? And Cortez looked like that guy. And Moctezuma, who was the king of the Aztecs at that time, kind of did a double take here as these guys showed up on his doorstep and said, "Oh, I'm going to let this guy in here. We're going to, he's the guy. He's the representation of this God. He's the fulfillment of this prophecy." So they were able to march into the middle of Mexico City without a fight, and they kind of hung out there, and they began to experience Aztec culture. And Cortez was amazed. He was amazed at the sophistication of the culture, at the wealth they had, at their apparent civilization, right? This enormous city and this enormous population, all these works of art and all these treasures, all these temples. But there was some dark stuff happening there too. You have to realize that these people are representatives, the conquistadors of Catholicism, of Western Christianity. And what the Aztecs were doing had not been seen or by a representative of Western civilization since the fall of Carthage. The human sacrifice and cannibalism on this scale was something that didn't exist in other parts of the world and had not for a very long time. And so Cortez would have seen that too. Um, People used to think that some of the descriptions of Mexico City, or Tenochtitlan, were exaggerations by the Spanish to make the Aztecs look worse than they were. One of the things that was reported by Cortez is this giant tower of human skulls that was right beside the main temple in the center of Tenochtitlan. He said, Cortez's historian, said that the thing was about the size of 3 football fields, about 50 feet tall, and constructed entirely of human skulls. And that on the surface of it, there were these enormous towers, frameworks made out of wood, upon which were hung more skulls. And one of Cortez's soldiers was given the task of trying to count the skulls, not in the mountain of skulls itself, but just on the superstructure above it. And he came up with like 150,000. Now, what this was when the Aztecs sacrificed a victim and then ate him or her, or children were sacrificed, animals were sacrificed. Their whole religious system was based on a certain kind of, well, it's that old horrible religion from the ancient world, really, just still existing. The idea that I can get the gods to do what I want if I'll do something horrible. And those skulls in that mountain represented those victims. So when the victim was consumed, right, they would take their skull and put it in the mountain. And so Cortez would have seen this and been absolutely horrified. And it's easy to see how someone with his particular cultural background would come into a place like this and see something like that and think, oh no, are these really people? Compounding the problem is that one of Cortez's groups, he had a group of people with him who they brought some women and children, and he left them with a small force in one of the cities that he had gone through. And people in that city captured them and sacrificed them and ate them. And Cortez found out about this right about the same time that this other event occurs. So this leads to this is the point at when this amazing movie right would reach a climax. The governor in Cuba sent an expedition to arrest Cortez. He sent his own troop of about 1,000 soldiers to find Cortez and bring him back in chains. Well, Cortez gets news that these people are on the way, and he takes his forces out of Mexico City and meets them at the shore and has a pitched battle with these forces from Cuba, these other Spanish soldiers. Cortez wins the battle, and he convinces the people that he's just beaten, those that are left, to join side with him. He's like, look, there's lots of gold here. This is amazing. And they sided with him. So he got some more soldiers as a result of this. And then he goes back to Mexico City. But while he was gone, this weird thing happens. The Aztecs were doing some kind of religious ceremony in one of their main squares there. And the small force that Cortez had left behind when he went to fight these guys that had come to get him, they staged a massacre. They basically attacked the Aztecs in that city square and massacred them. And then they drew back into their area they had been in the city and barricaded themselves in and waited for Cortez to return. So Cortez comes back into Mexico City, and the place is a powder keg. It's just about to explode. These people have figured out these can't be gods, right? They're not stupid, right? Despite what they thought in the beginning, they realized very quickly these are human beings and they're not good to us. And they are, Cortez was trying to get them to stop doing human sacrifice. He was destroying their idols. He was doing these things, and they had had enough. And Mexico City at this time was this weird place. It was the middle of a lake. Where Mexico City now stands was an actual lake. And the city was in the middle of this lake, and there were all these causeways, these bridges that you had to cross to get to the mainland. And Cortez found himself cut off in this city with the entire population about to attack. And so he gathered his forces, and at night they fought their way out of Mexico City. And they did so with the entire population of the city attacking them from all sides. They barely escaped with their lives. He lost nearly everybody. By the time they got to the shore, he had about 20 horses left. He had about 400 men, all of whom were wounded in some way. And with that small force, he went to war. And the initial battle he won was immediately afterwards. The entire military force of the city marched out to finish them off as they were trying to recover from their wounds in their little camp that they made as soon as they got out of the city. And the way Cortez won that battle was he took his 20 remaining horses and any man who could still ride one, and he charged into the middle of the Aztec army with those horses until he got to the guy that was I guess you'd call him the general. You could know who this guy was because of this enormous headdress that stood way up above everything else. And Cortez, his only hope was if he took that guy out, they'd stop, and they did. Aztec warfare was very ritualistic in many ways, and the loss of your general meant you quit fighting. And that's how Cortez managed to escape with just a small force left. And then he just rounded up everybody who would help out from the cities and villages around the Aztec capital and besieged it. And when he conquered it, he took it apart. He destroyed the entire city. And that was the end of the Aztec culture. And so, and a whole lot of horrible things after that, with a lot of abuses, a lot of terrible things. But that part of the story is just fascinating to me. I can't imagine that really happened in real life, but it did. So that's it. That's all I have to talk about now. I hope somebody sees this lecture. It's not all for nothing. Like I said, I'll be on campus on Wednesday, and obviously you can still call me or text me or any way you need to get a hold of me. I hope this was a good semester for you guys, and I will, I'll be teaching Humanities 2 in the very near future. So if you want to have me for your instructor on campus or online, just find out which sections I'm teaching. And hope you guys have an awesome rest of the summer.